So it's good to be back with you for this final session in our three-part series for the teaching stream of MMBC. In this series, we have been thinking about the church in exile and using the biblical exile to help us think and reflect on living our faith in the 21st century. If you've joined us previously, you will recall that we commented that Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann has suggested that the exile motif and metaphor can help the church understand her place in the world today, along with the contemporary Christian experience in the Western world of feeling dislocation, uncertainty and irrelevance within a host culture. We have also spoken about exile not necessarily being a physical relocation or forced migration away from a homeland to another land that is alien and strange, but can also be when beliefs are not shared across a particular culture. The result can be that held beliefs can bring a sense of being out of step with the surrounding dominant culture. You simply don't feel at home with those around you. You don't feel you fit in. In our first session, we were thinking about where we find ourselves in the present and explored the concept of exile in a broad sense, and commented that the metaphor of exile shouldn't be alien to us. If we have new birth in Jesus, then we are not born of this world. Our citizenship lies elsewhere. We also picked up the verses from Jeremiah 29, where God speaks to his people through the prophet and encourages them to bloom where they are planted, to make the most of the situation they find themselves in whilst in exile. Remember, we spoke about understanding the world we are part of, participating in it, keeping God central to our living, trusting him to bring about his purposes and plans, and then finally responding to the world around us in a Christ-like manner. Then in the second session, we explored the first of two fundamental challenges that the people in exile faced, that in the midst of their sorrow, being frustrated and longing to be home, God's people had to trust that God would sovereignly work his purposes and plans out and would bring them to fruition. There was the challenge to remain hopeful in and through the difficult circumstances they found themselves in. And you may recall that we spoke about how vital hope was and is to faith, and what happens when hope is lost. We also said that the hope we have as followers of Jesus is not a wishful thinking or a dreaming for the impossible, both of which have a sort of negative connotation, because 1 Peter 1 verse 3 speaks about our hope being a living hope, a hope that was alive and real, and that it was not a natural hope because it had resurrection power connected to it. You may also recall that we spoke about this hope being linked to the future promise that God has for his people. And you may remember that we spent some time saying that exile is not the end of the matter, that God would fulfill his promises, and that was the hope that we have. Hope is foundational in the story of God's people and is vitally important for those living in exile, both then and for the church today. We drew our thoughts to a close at the end of the last session, saying that as we foster our exilic hope, we remember that God cares for and is present with his people, that he is sovereign over all of human history, and that he has a vision, a plan and a purpose for his creation, and it is good. We also mentioned last time that there was a second fundamental challenge that those in exile faced, namely that they needed to remain faithful to God in a land full of idolatry. In essence, how did those in exile retain their identity as God's people? And it's this challenge that I would like to explore in this final teaching stream. Brueggemann picks this challenge up when he comments that the exiles found themselves in a hostile, alien environment where the predominant temptation is assimilation. To assimilate into the dominant culture is a very real danger for a faith community in exile. it is a temptation to compromise on essentials in order to fit in with that culture. This in turn leads to an unhealthy loss of community ideals and identity. Theologian Paul Williams suggests that there are two routes to assimilation. The first is to blur the differences between cultures and minimise different beliefs, doctrines or practices. This leads to a merging of different religions, an absorption of different religions. The second route to assimilation is the attempt to hide one's own identity and to pretend to be a member of and blend into the dominant culture. A second temptation also exists for a faith community in exile. That is, not to assimilate, but rather to deliberately and provocatively withdraw from the strange culture. Instead of trying to fit in, the faith community tries to cope by grouping together in the relative safety and security of its own community that's defined by its story, and it cuts itself off from the alien culture beyond its boundary. This can lead to the exiled community adopting a defensive identity in the face of her surrounding hostile culture, can even result in feeling more isolated. Both of these temptations, assimilation and withdrawal, are rooted in the emotions of fear and anger. Fear because of the shame, the embarrassment, the cultural disadvantage of trying to live out their faith in a strange land. Anger because this is not where the people want to be, and they don't deserve the suffering they are enduring and facing. Take a moment to think about the Babylonian exile. With the conquest of God's people, three major symbols, the land, the king, and the temple, were all lost. This is really significant because those three symbols all contributed to who they understood themselves to be. The land had been promised to the Israelites and was a symbol of God's faithfulness and enabled them to establish themselves as a distinct people. Likewise, the king was significant. He was a sign of the covenant relationship between God and his people and symbolised God's leadership amongst them. And third, the temple. This was the place where Israel believed God dwelled and presenced himself with his people. It was a sign that God reigned supreme. With the Babylonians now in charge, all three symbols were gone. The land was not their own. The king had been killed and the temple lay in ruins. Along with the loss of these symbols, the people also lost their identity. The exile meant that the people lost everything. But also think slightly forward in history. Think Daniel and his three friends. In exile, their names are changed to Babylonian ones. They are taught various practices and arts. They are part of the Babylonian culture. But yet there are moments when they resist the host land's assimilation process and maintain their own religious practices, especially with regard to prayer and worship. Add into the mix the stories of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, all located after the story of Daniel and the Babylonian exile. In all of the above, we find Jewish people at the centre of their captivating empire, playing their part, being fruitful, maybe we could even say blooming where they have been planted. But we also see a moment in each case where they identify themselves with the people and with the God of Israel. And certainly in the case of Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther, with their homeland many miles away. There are those moments in these narratives where the central characters decide to make a stand. They remember their history and their heritage. They remember who they truly are. Theologian Lee Beach says that identity formation for God's people in exilic situations is foundational to their survival. That ties neatly with this second foundational challenge that we are thinking about in this session. It is important that God's people remember who they are And it's easier to remember who you are when you are part of a community who remembers who they are and stand together and share that corporate identity. Beach further suggests that central to Israel's response in exile was an impetus to pursue holiness. He says, holiness is an identity issue for the people of God at all times. However, in times of exile, it becomes the category under which boundaries are explored and in which distinct behaviours are described and defined. Here, Beach is picking up the idea that biblical holiness is characterised by being set apart. This reflects something of the Hebrew and Greek words used for holiness in the two Testaments. Bible teacher Warren Wiersbe comments that the word translated holy simply means different. He says that a holy person is not an odd person, but a different person. Their life has a quality about it that is different. Their present lifestyle is not only different from their past life, but it is different from the lifestyles of unbelievers around them. Being set apart calls for behaviours that reflect the ethics of faith by engaging in the world in constructive ways. In turn, this contributes positively to the overall life of the community in which we live. It also means that we disengage from those practices that have a negative effect on our faith living and discipleship. The result being that by practicing these aspects consistently, we define our identity and show what makes God's people distinct. It would be easy to think in negative terms here, and often the evangelical tradition is known for what it is against. Scripturally, I think the practices of holiness are not simply the following of certain rules and regulations, but they are the practices that cultivate a relationship of love and obedience. They are practices that are rooted in relationship, and it seems clear that this relational holiness is intrinsic to the biblical vision for life in this world. 1 Peter also captures this idea as the author ties his call to holiness to his audience's relationship to God through Jesus Christ. Throughout this teaching stream, I have been encouraging you to read and reread this short epistle, and I hope you have been able to do that during the week and sense something of how Peter has been encouraging his fellow believers in the places where God has placed them. Remember, we mentioned in our first session that 1 Peter was an exilic text, written with that purpose in mind. At several key moments in his letter, Peter says, therefore, and he uses it in a way that turns identity into action, indicatives into imperatives. In doing so, Peter says, this is what I've been saying. This is what it looks like. And again, this is really important, because if there is no therefore, if the gospel is not able to bring about change and transform us, then it remains merely theological theory. There has to be a therefore. Let me take you one last time to some verses from 1 Peter 1, and we will read verses 13 to 16 and pick up on one of Peter's therefores. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. 1 Peter shows us how our new identity as the people of God enables us to live on the margins. We see that the stranger's motif is more than just descriptive, as it also suggests how Peter's readers are to relate to an alien culture. Take a moment to think about your own encounters and visits to another culture, maybe whilst on holiday or a business trip, or even on a mission trip. Try and remember what you thought and how you felt. Think about how you related to those you met and the things you saw. As foreigners, Christians are to treat their host culture with respect, honour those in authority, and seek its prosperity. Something of Jeremiah 29 there again. But we will never really feel at home in that culture. It may help us at this point to think about the role of diplomats, to emphasise the point I'm trying to make. A diplomat's ultimate allegiance is to their homeland. After all, that is where they are citizens. That is where their hearts are. That is who has sent them to be their representatives. And as they represent their homeland, they do so by showing respect for the culture and people of the country they are living in, even when difficult conversations need to be had. Respect and dignity is maintained. And here in these few verses from 1 Peter, our author is saying something similar. Although we have been distanced from our previous culture and lifestyle by our new birth, we pursue the cause of our King by showing respect to those around us. Identity is key, and holiness, that sense of being set apart, is intrinsic to who we are in Christ. According to 1 Peter, 2 alternatives are open to the follower of Jesus who lives in an alien land. One may either conform to the world around it, or one can be set apart and live as holy. The Gentile believers of Asia Minor knew no different. But now Peter says that their worldview has changed. They have more insight now than any Old Testament prophet, and as a result, their daily living needs to be transformed. They need to be obedient and live the way that God requires them to live, even if that is in a culture and society that is at odds with their beliefs and practices. For the believer in exile, a reorientation has taken place, and Peter reminds his readers of this when he quotes the Old Testament book of Leviticus, chapter 11, verse 42. Be holy because I am holy. Be set apart because I am set apart. Be different because I am different. So, as we begin to draw this session to a close and summarise the teaching stream, how might you be deliberate and intentional in pursuing holiness in your daily living? Let me suggest a few things for starters, and this isn't in any way exhaustive. First, in pursuing holiness, it is important that in the first instance that we pursue God himself, his kingdom, his ways. He has to be the priority in our living. He has to be the one who directs our lives. He has to be the one around whom we orientate our whole living. After all, he is the one who created us and the one that we serve. So the question to ask here is, how central is God to the whole of our living? And do we rotate around him rather than he around us? Next, in pursuing holiness, it is important that we deal with anything that might hinder our relationship with God. If we know of areas or aspects of our living that do not bring honour to God, let's confess and remove them from our lives so that we are not burdened, distracted or held back by things that are not godly. So the question to ask here is, are there things in our lives, attitudes, behaviours, areas of our lives that we know are not honouring to God? We can come and ask God to work on them with us. Finally, in pursuing holiness, it's important that we grow our relationship with our Father in heaven. Daily discipleship is not a course or a program we undertake. Daily discipleship is an adventure of following Jesus wherever he may lead us. We know that encouraging and forming discipleship is one of the things that churches are called to do. But in exile, whilst church remains important, we also take responsibility for our own spiritual growth and development. And we think about how we can become self-sustaining disciples who are able to feed themselves and able to share something of their faith and story. So the question to ask is, how do we pursue our walk with God in such a way that our daily living reflects that we live by different values and that we are different to the dominant culture around us? Let me draw this session and this teaching stream to its close. During our time together, we have been thinking about the church in exile and considering if there are things that we can learn from the biblical exile for our own daily living and discipleship today. In a world that is rapidly changing and continues to change at what seems to be an accelerated pace. We don't need to be told how bad things are or even how bad things might get in the future. Instead, we need to be encouraged and prepared to stand in the world where God has placed his people. Leslie Newbigin, the Anglican bishop who returned from India to the UK and showed the church here the mission field that was on our doorstep, once said, "The only hermeneutic of the gospel is a congregation of men and women who believe it and live by it." That's a theological way of saying that the church demonstrates the gospel. We see the action of what we read in Scripture. In the first session of this teaching stream, we reflected on the nature of exile and said that this is the place where we are. And in that place, we are asked to be fruitful and bloom where we have been planted. In the second session, and this one, we considered two challenges faced by those living in exile, and we explored the issues of hope and identity. As we conclude this teaching stream series, may God continue to bless your endeavours for him and his kingdom. Goodbye for now.